The Mesopotamian sun had long surrendered to the embrace of dusk when Dr. Sarah Chen first felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her shoulders. She knelt beside the excavation pit, her weathered hands carefully brushing centuries of accumulated dust from what appeared to be fragments of ancient parchment. The site, located 30 kilometers southeast of modern-day Baghdad, had yielded treasures that defied conventional biblical archaeology, but nothing quite like this. Professor Chen called Marcus, her graduate assistant, his voice carrying an unusual tremor. "You need to see this. The symbols, they're not like anything in our databases." Sarah rose slowly, her knees protesting after 12 hours of meticulous excavation. The dig site sprawled before her like an open wound in the earth, illuminated by harsh floodlights that created dancing shadows among the ancient stone walls.
For 3 months, they had been uncovering what appeared to be a pre-flood settlement, but the artifacts they discovered suggested something far more significant, a repository of texts that predated known biblical manuscripts by millennia. The fragment Marcus held seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The parchment, if it could be called that, appeared to be made from some unknown material that shifted between leather and stone, depending on the angle of observation. The symbols etched upon its surface were neither Hebrew nor Aramaic, yet Sarah found herself able to read them with disturbing clarity. When the breath of life departed from the first of flesh, she who was bone of his bone lingered in the shadow of the tree. The words seemed to whisper themselves into existence as Sarah's eyes traced the fading symbols. A chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening settled deep in her bones. "Professor?" Marcus stepped closer, his young face etched with concern. "Are you all right? You've gone completely pale." Sarah blinked, realizing she had been reading aloud without conscious intention. The camp around them had fallen unnaturally silent. Even the constant hum of generators seemed muted, as if the very air had thickened with anticipation. "Get everyone back to the main tent," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Now, but it was too late. The shadows cast by the floodlights had begun to move independently of their sources, stretching and writhing, like living things across the excavation site. And in the deepest part of the pit, where they had uncovered what appeared to be a burial chamber, something was stirring. The main archaeological tent buzzed with nervous energy as Sarah's team gathered around the central table. The fragment lay under protective glass, yet the strange symbols continued their subtle dance across its surface. Dr. James Morrison, the team's linguist, peered through his magnifying apparatus with increasing frustration. "It's impossible," he muttered, adjusting his glasses for the 5th time in as many minutes. "The substrate appears to be organic, but carbon dating suggests it's at least 4,000 years old. Yet it shows no signs of decay." Sarah had been having the dreams for 3 weeks now, visions of a garden bathed in ethereal light, where 2 figures walked among trees that seemed to whisper secrets older than civilization. In her dreams, she witnessed conversations in a language that predated human speech, saw the first death cast its shadow over paradise, and felt the weight of unanswered questions that had haunted theology for millennia. "What troubles me most," she said, studying the fragment, "is how naturally I can read these symbols. It's as if they were written specifically for us to find." Marcus, ever the skeptical graduate student, leaned forward. Could it be some form of ancient pictography, something that transcends specific languages? Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Amira Hassan, their archaeological specialist, burst into the tent with barely contained excitement. "You all need to see what we found in the lower chamber. There's an entire wall covered in these symbols, and Sarah, there's something else, something that shouldn't exist." They followed Amira back to the excavation site, where the floodlights now cast an almost supernatural glow over the ancient stones. The burial chamber they had partially uncovered revealed itself to be far more extensive than initially believed. Stone steps led down into darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. At the bottom of the chamber, carved into a wall of black stone, were hundreds of the same mysterious symbols. But what captured everyone's attention was the figure carved in relief at the center, a woman's form, hands outstretched toward an empty space where another figure might once have stood. "The carving shows signs of deliberate defacement," Amira explained, her voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space, as if someone tried to erase the second figure entirely. Sarah approached the wall, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't name. The symbols seemed to glow faintly in the artificial light, and as she drew closer she could hear what sounded like whispers in a language that predated memory. She who tasted death second carried the burden of witnessing first. The words formed themselves in her mind as her fingers traced the ancient carvings. Behind her she could hear her team discussing the implications of their find, but their voices seemed to come from a great distance. The whispers were growing stronger, more insistent. "Read the words, daughter of dust. Speak what was written when the world was young." Sarah's hand found another fragment embedded in the wall, larger than the first, with symbols that seemed to burn within her fire. Without conscious thought, she began to read aloud. When Adam, first among the living, drew his final breath beneath the tree of knowledge, Eve held vigil as his flesh returned to dust. But death, newly birthed into the world, was hungry for completion. The Watcher came to claim what was promised, the second death that would seal the fate of all who would follow. The air in the chamber grew thick and oppressive. Above them, the team's voices became sharp with alarm as equipment began to malfunction and shadows started moving against the direction of light. "Professor Chen," Marcus called down, his voice tight with fear, "you need to come up here. Something's wrong with the dig site." But Sarah couldn't move. The symbols on the wall were now glowing with an unmistakable light, and the whispers had become a chorus of voices speaking in unison. The truth of who died first awakens the Watcher. The mystery calls to what was never meant to be disturbed. The camp descended into chaos as equipment failed and shadows took on lives of their own. The floodlights flickered and dimmed, creating a landscape of moving darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. "Doctor?" Morrison was the first to notice that the shadows didn't align with any light source. They moved independently, reaching toward the archaeological team like grasping fingers. "Everyone stay together," Sarah commanded, emerging from the chamber with the large manuscript fragment clutched in her hands. "Don't touch anything with bare hands after sunset, and whatever you do, don't follow any shadow that moves on its own." The ancient rules seemed to whisper themselves into her consciousness, knowledge that came from somewhere beyond academic training. She knew, with the certainty of instinct, that survival depended on following protocols that had been established in humanity's first encounter with the supernatural. Dr. Hassan pointed toward the eastern edge of the dig site, where a figure seemed to materialize from the gathering darkness. It moved with the fluid grace of smoke, shifting between the form of a man bent with age and the silhouette of a woman whose face was hidden in shadow. "The Watcher of Dust and Seed," Sarah breathed, the name arising from knowledge she had never learned. "It feeds on unanswered mysteries, on the spaces between what was and what might have been." The entity paused at the edge of their camp, and Sarah could see that it was composed of both light and darkness, as if it existed in the liminal space between life and death. Its form continued to shift, sometimes appearing as Adam in his final moments, sometimes as Eve in the aftermath of loss. Who died first? The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, carrying the weight of millennia. The question that haunts your kind since the beginning, the mystery that calls us from our rest. Marcus took an involuntary step forward, drawn by curiosity despite his fear. Sarah grabbed his arm, remembering another rule that had whispered itself into her consciousness: remain absolutely still when the Watcher appears, for movement draws its attention. The entity's attention turned toward them, and Sarah could feel the weight of its gaze like physical pressure. It began to move closer, its form becoming more defined with each step. She could see now that it carried elements of both the first humans, Adam's weathered hands that had once tilled the earth outside Eden, and Eve's eyes that had witnessed the first death in creation. "You have read the forbidden words," the Watcher said, its voice layering upon itself like echoes in an infinite canyon. "You have awakened what was meant to sleep until the end of days. Now the truth must be revealed, though it destroys those who hear it." The manuscript in Sarah's hands grew warm, then hot, as symbols began appearing that hadn't been visible before. The story was completing itself, driven by the presence of the ancient entity. Adam died first, his body returning to dust as was decreed. But Eve chose a different path. When death came for her, she bargained with the darkness itself, trading her own rest for the chance to guard the mystery of their ending. She became the keeper of the threshold between life and death, watching over the question that would define humanity's relationship with mortality. The Watcher extended what might have been Adam's hand, and Sarah could see Eve's face reflected in its palm. The truth was more complex than anyone had imagined. Eve hadn't simply died second, she had chosen to exist in the space between life and death, becoming part of the mystery itself. As the night deepened, the archaeological site transformed into something that existed outside normal time and space. The Watcher's presence seemed to bend reality around it, creating pockets where the ancient world bled through into the present. Sarah's team found themselves witnesses to visions that spanned millennia, glimpses of Adam's final days outside Eden, of Eve's vigil beside his dying form, and of the choice that had created the entity now standing before them. Dr. Morrison, his academic skepticism crumbling in the face of supernatural reality, documented everything with the desperate precision of a scholar who knew he was witnessing history's most profound mystery. "The implications are staggering," he whispered, his hands shaking as he wrote. "If Eve chose to become something between life and death, it explains theological questions that have puzzled scholars for centuries." The Watcher moved among them now, its form constantly shifting between Adam's mortality and Eve's chosen immortality. It seemed drawn to the manuscript Sarah held, as if the ancient text was a key that had unlocked its prison. "For centuries, your kind has asked who died first," the entity spoke, its voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in their bones. "But the true question is who chose death, and who chose to transcend it. Adam accepted the return to dust as natural order. Eve saw death and chose to become its guardian rather than its victim." Sarah felt the weight of theological implications pressing down on her. If Eve had chosen to exist beyond normal death, it recontextualized every interpretation of the fall, of redemption, of humanity's relationship with mortality itself. "But why reveal this now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why allow us to find the manuscript?" The Watcher turned toward her, and for a moment, its shifting form stabilized into something that was neither fully Adam nor completely Eve, but something that contained elements of both, a representation of humanity's first encounter with the possibility of choosing one's own fate in the face of divine decree. "Because the time of questions is ending," it said. "The world approaches the moment when all mysteries will be revealed, when the choice Eve made will be offered to all her children. You have been chosen to carry this knowledge forward, to prepare humanity for what is to come." The manuscript in Sarah's hands began to change, new text appearing as if written by an invisible hand. She could see the complete story now, not just of who died first, but of the cosmic implications of that death, of Eve's bargain with the forces beyond creation, and of the role humanity was meant to play in the great mystery of existence itself. Marcus, forgetting the rules in his excitement, stepped forward to get a closer look at the transforming manuscript. The moment he moved, the Watcher's attention fixed on him with terrifying intensity. "You break the covenant of stillness," it said, its voice suddenly filled with the authority of cosmic law. "Movement draws attention, attention demands payment." The temperature around Marcus dropped precipitously as the Watcher extended what appeared to be Eve's hand toward him. Sarah could see frost forming on the young man's breath, and his eyes widened with the realization that he had violated one of the fundamental rules of survival. "Wait," Sarah called out, stepping between her student and the ancient entity. "If knowledge demands payment, let me be the one to pay it. I'm the one who read the manuscript aloud. I'm the one who awakened you." The Watcher paused, its form shimmering between Adam's compassion and Eve's fierce protectiveness, the leader who takes responsibility for her followers. "You show wisdom, daughter of dust, very well. But know that knowledge of this magnitude cannot be given freely. A price must be paid." Sarah felt the manuscript growing heavier in her hands, as if it was absorbing not just light, but the very substance of reality around them. The symbols were now glowing so brightly that they cast their own illumination, revealing details of the excavation site that had been hidden in shadow. "What kind of price?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "To know the truth of who died first, you must experience what they experienced. To understand Eve's choice, you must make a choice of your own." The air around Sarah began to shimmer, and suddenly she was no longer standing in the archaeological dig. She found herself in a garden that existed outside of time, where the light came from no visible source, and the trees seemed to grow from pure possibility rather than soil. Before her stood two figures: Adam, old and weary, his body showing the effects of centuries outside paradise, and Eve, ageless and terrible, her eyes holding the weight of cosmic knowledge. Between them lay the tree of knowledge, its fruit now withered but still radiating the power that had changed everything. "Watch," the Watcher's voice commanded. "See what was, and understand what must be." Sarah witnessed Adam's final breath, saw how death claimed him gently, as a return to the earth from which he had been formed. But when death reached for Eve, she spoke words in the original language of creation, words that bound her to the threshold between life and death, making her a guardian of the mystery that would define human existence. She chose to become the question rather than accept the answer, the Watcher explained. To exist in the space where mystery lives, so that humanity would always have the possibility of choosing its own relationship with mortality. Sarah felt the cosmic weight of Eve's decision, understood how it had created the space for free will, for the possibility of redemption, for the complex relationship between humanity and the divine that had shaped history. But with understanding came a terrible choice of her own. Now you must choose, the Watcher said, its form now clearly showing both Adam's mortality and Eve's transcendence. You can return to your world with this knowledge, but you will carry the burden of truth that few can bear. Or you can join the guardianship, become part of the mystery itself, and help guide humanity toward the great choosing that approaches. Sarah looked back toward the archaeological site, where she could see her team frozen in time, their faces etched with fear and wonder. Marcus stood where she had left him, his hand still reaching toward the space she had occupied. Dr. Morrison clutched his notes, and Dr. Hassan stared at the glowing symbols on the chamber wall. The choice was more complex than simple life or death. She could return to her ordinary existence, but with the knowledge that reality was far more fluid and mysterious than anyone imagined. She would spend the rest of her life trying to convince a skeptical world of truths that defied academic proof, watching as the manuscript's revelations were dismissed as hallucinations or hoax. Or she could accept the role of guardian, joining Eve in the liminal space between life and death, helping to prepare humanity for the approaching time when everyone would have to make similar choices about their relationship with mortality and transcendence. "What happens to my team?" she asked. "They return with fragments of truth, enough to plant seeds of understanding, not enough to carry the full burden. They will write papers that no one quite believes, document artifacts that seem to change when examined too closely. But the seeds will grow, and when the time comes, humanity will be slightly more prepared." Sarah felt the weight of cosmic responsibility settling on her shoulders. The manuscript in her hands was no longer just parchment and ink. It was a living document that contained the possibilities of human choice in the face of ultimate questions. "Choose quickly," the Watcher urged. "Dawn approaches, and the window for decision closes with the light." Sarah looked at the manuscript one final time, seeing now that it contained not just the story of Adam and Eve's deaths, but the template for every choice humanity would face about transcendence, sacrifice, and the nature of existence itself. She made her decision. Dr. Marcus Chen, the name felt strange on his lips, as if he had inherited more than just responsibility for the dig, stood at the edge of the excavation site as dawn broke over the Mesopotamian landscape. The events of the night seemed like a fever dream, except for the undeniable evidence scattered around the camp. The manuscript fragment lay on the table in the main tent, its symbols now faded to barely visible marks. Dr. Morrison's carefully documented notes described encounters with supernatural entities, but in the harsh light of day, they read like the delusions of an overworked mind. Dr. Hassan had photographed the chamber wall with its carved relief, but the images showed only ordinary stone carvings that could be interpreted a dozen different ways. Professor Sarah Chen was gone. Her tent remained exactly as she had left it, her personal effects undisturbed, her laptop still showing the research, notes she had been compiling about Genesis traditions. But Sarah herself had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, except for the memories that grew hazier with each passing hour. "We need to contact the university," Dr. Morrison said, his voice lacking its usual academic confidence. "Sarah's disappearance. We'll need to file reports." But Marcus found himself hesitating as he looked at the manuscript fragment. He could swear he saw something moving in its faded symbols, a suggestion of text that wasn't quite there, a promise of knowledge that existed just beyond the edge of perception. "Give me another day," he heard himself saying. "Let me review the site one more time before we pack up." That evening, as his colleagues prepared for sleep, Marcus returned to the burial chamber. The carved relief on the wall seemed different somehow. The female figure's hands were positioned slightly differently, and there was a suggestion of another presence beside her, as if someone else had joined her in the carved narrative. As he studied the ancient artwork, Marcus thought he heard whispers in a language that predated memory. And for just a moment, in the corner of his vision, he glimpsed a figure watching from the shadows, someone who might have been Professor Chen, but wasn't quite, existing in the space between presence and absence, between question and answer. The whispers seemed to be offering him a choice. 3 months later, Dr. Marcus Chen published a paper titled "Anomalous Archaeological Discoveries in Pre-Flood Mesopotamian Sites" in the Journal of Biblical Archaeology. The academic community received it with polite skepticism, noting the unusual nature of the artifacts described and the strange circumstances surrounding Professor Sarah Chen's disappearance during the expedition. The manuscript fragments were donated to the Iraqi National Museum, where they were catalogued and placed in climate-controlled storage. Visitors occasionally reported seeing symbols that seemed to move on the ancient parchment, but these accounts were dismissed as optical illusions caused by the museum's lighting. Dr. Morrison returned to his position at Oxford, where he began having dreams about gardens that existed outside of time. His classes on ancient languages took on an intensity that disturbed some students and captivated others, as he spoke about texts that seemed to write themselves in words that carried the weight of cosmic truth. Dr. Hassan continued her archaeological work, but found herself drawn to sites associated with death and transcendence. Her colleagues noted that she had developed an uncanny ability to locate burial chambers and sacred spaces, as if guided by knowledge that came from beyond academic training. And sometimes, late at night in their respective corners of the world, all three former team members would simultaneously stop what they were doing and listen to whispers in a language that predated human speech. They would remember, briefly and incompletely, a night when the boundaries between myth and reality had dissolved, when they had stood witness to humanity's first encounter with the choice between acceptance and transcendence. The question of who died first, Adam or Eve, remains officially unanswered in theological circles. But in certain academic publications, carefully worded papers appear occasionally, suggesting that the question itself might be the wrong one to ask. Perhaps, these papers suggest, the real mystery isn't about the order of death, but about the nature of choice in the face of mortality, and in the spaces between what is known and what is possible, in the liminal realm where questions become more important than answers. The Watcher of Dust and Seed continues its ancient vigil. It waits for the time when humanity will be ready to make the same choice that was offered to Eve, when the mystery of existence itself will become the foundation for transcendence. The manuscript fragments occasionally disappear from their storage location, only to reappear days later with new text that wasn't there before. Museum security reviews footage that shows nothing unusual, but visitors sometimes report seeing figures moving through the displays after hours, a woman with ancient eyes and a man bent with the weight of cosmic knowledge, continuing their eternal conversation about choice, death, and the price of wisdom. The dig site in Mesopotamia has been officially closed, its location marked as unstable due to shifting sands and subsurface anomalies. But satellite imagery occasionally shows lights there at night, and local Bedouin tribes speak of voices heard in the desert wind, voices that ask questions in the original language of creation, waiting for answers that will determine the future of human consciousness itself. The mystery continues, as it was always meant to, and somewhere in the space, between life and death, between question and answer, Professor Sarah Chen stands guard over the greatest secret of all, that the power to choose transcendence has always belonged to humanity, waiting only for the courage to embrace mystery rather than demand certainty. The Watcher of Dust and Seed sleeps fitfully, knowing that the time of great choosing approaches when every human soul will face the same decision that divided Adam's acceptance from Eve's transcendence. And when that time comes, the knowledge preserved in ancient manuscripts and guarded by those who chose to become part of the mystery itself will finally serve its purpose. The question of who died first will be answered not by archaeological discovery, but by each individual's choice about who they will become when faced with the ultimate mystery of existence.